Afternoon, everyone. Welcome. For those I have not met, I am Jenni Goodman, the Director of Community at _VC. I am so excited to welcome Gabriela Serret-Campos, the VP of People at Chronosphere, for the February edition of our Core Collective series. Great to have you here, Gabriela.
Thanks so much, Jenni.
Let me just share my screen briefly. There we go. And there you are. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping for the event. The goal is to share collective learnings together, so we hope you'll add to this conversation. Drop in any questions you have for Gabriela in the Q&A section of the chat, and we'll be able to ask those to her. We'll also be live tweeting today, and we hope you'll be able to join us for that. You could find us at _VC on Twitter. And a quick reminder on who we are at _. We are a community-driven early stage venture firm. We back seed stage founders predominantly in the B2B SaaS space. And the community behind our community-driven model is the _core, a curated group of founders, entrepreneurs, executives, and subject matter experts designed to support each other, the Boston tech ecosystem, and our _ portfolio. And we work in partnership with the core in every aspect of our investing, from sourcing to selecting to scaling. And we'll drop a link in the chat where you can learn more about the community. Here's just a little sneak peek of what Gabriela and I will be chatting about today. So hi, Gabriela. It's been so wonderful getting to know you through our HR and talent core community, and I'm thrilled to get to have this discussion with you today.
Wow, thrilled to be here. So thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So just a little quick bio about Gabriela. She's the VP of People Operations at Chronosphere, which is a cloud-native monitoring platform that recently raised its Series C. And prior to Chronosphere, Gabriela was the SVP of People Ops at Drizly, where she led the company's people operations through rapid scale through its $1.2 billion acquisition by Uber. And she is passionate about aligning people with purpose to drive performance and attracting, developing, and retaining top talent to build strong, diverse, and engaged teams. Quite the impressive background. I'm so glad we get to learn from you today. So first item on our agenda, which is one of my favorite things to always hear, is kind of a startup confession. So I'd love to know from you, Gabriela, what's something unexpected you've seen or experiencing while building your career in a startup space?
I feel like there's so many confessions you could go down the path of when it's like startup, especially if it was like mistakes that I've made or confessions, like I'd have a laundry list. I think when people get to know me, the thing that surprises them most is, especially given the work that I do, really in the people space, is that early in my career, and not even early, probably the first decade of my career, I didn't really, not that I didn't believe in it, but the idea of loving what you do for me felt a little bit like a fallacy. And honestly, it felt a little entitled. And I think people are really surprised when they hear that about me. And to give a little bit of context there, because I don't believe it's an entitled approach, but both my parents are immigrants. So they really came to this country with the idea of we're coming here to work, to have opportunity to make, and I've had lots of aunts and uncles that have then come, to this country following my mother. But the idea of having a job, just that in itself can be a privilege in so many different places. So I was really raised with that mentality and that mindset. And I remember being younger and watching Oprah and having her talk about loving what you do and being so inspired by that, but also believing that was like a super small percentage. And that for most people, just having a job, that was the privilege. And so it's funny now when I think back to that, where people are like, your whole work and everything that you do is around just like loving what you do and building spaces that people love. And so I think it's pretty comical when people realize that, like, yeah, I have no idea how I ended up in this space, because initially I was like, you have a job. That should be enough. So it's been a really interesting transition from that, but I would say that's what usually surprises people most. I don't know if that counts as a good confession or not, but
I love that. How did you transition from, that mindset to where you are now?
Yeah, it was really interesting. It was actually the first true tech company that I worked at. This company called Infusionsoft over in Arizona. I had been recruited there because I had kind of started a sales enablement function, and then as part of that, we did kind of a management training program at a previous organization. So I got recruited to go to this company, Infusionsoft, and it was the first time I saw a company that was truly values aligned. They really used kind of the Jim Collins methodology, but really, really, truly values aligned. And I was able to see the power of when you have an aligned audience and you're aligned not just from a values perspective and but directionally, like you have that directional alignment towards like the company purpose, towards the company mission. And I was able to see just the difference that it makes in an environment for the different humans. And I believe that everyone can find that. It's not that every one organization works for everybody, but if you're really intentional there, you can find like-minded individuals that are aligned towards that same common goal, and it helps you cast like a really wide net and just have fabulous people. So I think it was seeing it for the first time and then being able to test out a few different practices and getting really curious and then reading more about it. And then again, you just start seeing the results over and over again, and it just becomes such a clear-cut formula.
It's amazing. It sounds like kind of the culture they had really helped you develop and have that like strong belief that you have
Oh,
now.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Speaking of cultures, when it comes to creating a strong culture, what common mistakes do you see early leaders make? And what have you learned to help prevent those mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially, especially if we're talking about rapid growth companies. So I would say back in the day when I used to run a leadership development organization, we used to work with rapidly scaling companies, typically post Series B, Series C. So when I see companies that have that influx of cash, typically they're going to grow really quickly, right? Grow either from an R&D perspective or maybe their sales and marketing functions. And even companies that are truly focused on people and they want to be human centric around this, oftentimes you're prioritizing where those dollars go. So usually it's to hire relatively quickly. So I would say the mistakes that I often see are hiring quickly without a lot of clear intentionality as to what we're hiring for. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people that put together job descriptions. They're like, oh yeah, they just Google the job description and then like cut and paste different pieces from different companies' job descriptions. And I can say it's like, even saying it sounds funny, but so many people do it, right? I'm sure like if we took a poll in here, some people would be like, yeah, definitely done that before. I've done it before. And I think just understanding that you have to be super intentional on who you're looking to hire because it'll have like ramifications long term. I think the other thing as well is I've seen a lot of organizations, even not even from a JD perspective, but even holistically taking a step back and saying, what are the values? How do we want people to behave? What are the competitive differentiators that we have from a cultural perspective that we believe are going to advance our organization? So I think not having that also it's a little bit, it puts you in a precarious state, especially if you're rapidly growing. So for me, if I was at an organization, I would say really start getting the values early, values, vision, mission, strategy, kind of all of that piece, because it helps align people towards that common goal and it helps you cast a wider net. And then when you're hiring people, just getting super, super intentional, being intentional on what are you looking for truly? Like, what are the competencies? What are the non-negotiables? And then holding to that.
Awesome. How do you see people, keeping the same values when their companies are growing and scaling? It seems like it could be, you think you have a certain set of values when maybe you have 10 people, you're super early stage, and then all of a sudden you have 200, 500 people. How do you make sure those values also grow?
I mean, I think it's really around, do you want these to be everlasting values? So there's just such great literature out there around this. I'm a huge fan of Jim Collins. Patrick Lencioni does a lot of work on this as well. But I think that there's, oftentimes I see the way I think of values, there's usually three big buckets, and there could be other buckets, right? But these is how I usually think about them. There's your core values, right? And those are values that are core and authentic to who you are as an organization, as a human today. And those are the ones that typically you want and you believe will be competitive differentiators even moving forward because they're so core to you. You wouldn't be able to not do that anyway, right? So that's how I think of core values. And I'll come back to that and answer your question momentarily. I often see also accidental values where oftentimes if you're not intentional about that and you start hiring, say, I'm like, man, Jenni's amazing at her job. I want to hire 10 more Jennis. So I might look for people that have like similar personality traits to Jenni, or, oh my goodness, they all also worked at this company with Jenni. they must have something in common there, or they went to this school with Jenni. So then you start seeing a lot of bias start creeping in. And those accidental values, sometimes they can work out, but it's a lack of intention, right? It's almost like throwing spaghetti to a wall and you're seeing what sticks. You have to be really, really careful there. And then I see a lot of aspirational values, right? And this, there could be some debate, and I'm not part of the camp of it's good or it's bad. I think anything can work as long as you frame it and you articulate the why behind it. With aspirational values, if you have a mix of core and aspirational, I think it get clunky and confusing, right? So if you have a value, say you're a company where you're not really data driven, you're saying like, we're going to be data driven, and you start using data driven as something that's aspirational. Oftentimes, if you're just like listing them, people might not know if you're talking about something that's a little bit more core aspirational. So then it can just start to lose credibility internally. So if I'm working in an organization, we're saying we're data driven, I'm seeing things that don't feel like they're aligning to that value, I just might start to lose credibility or might feel inauthentic. So for me, I think of the core values. So to your question of as you're scaling and growing, I think you have to ask yourself a few different questions. It's not just the humans that make up that 10% company in the beginning. Some people might have 10 core values, some people could have 100, right? Like it's really, values is something so personal. So I think you start looking for what's authentic, what authentically exists, and what are the things that have really made an impact in that organization to date, right? So say it's only a year old. What are the things that get you through those foxhole moments, right? The hard times, the great times. When you think back to the stories that you're sharing with your friends and family, what are the values and the themes that are coming up in those stories? And then I think you need to take a pause. And once you have that list, you start saying, okay, do we believe these are going to be competitive advantages for us moving forward? If we have competitors in the space, would this be a value that we would want to hold on to in that space? Would we be able to defend the fact that we believe that we would do it better than or greater than our competitors in this space? And would we like hold ourselves to that? So I think it's a series of reflection questions, not just thinking of the present moment, but also forward looking, that really helps you mitigate that risk of, okay, at 10, we're this, but at 100, we're this, because hopefully you have that alignment throughout. The other piece too is I would say I see values often get re-articulated, but oftentimes the core is the same unless you've seen a whole new leadership team come in, or if it's a really, doing kind of a big pivot. So I also like to think of it from that perspective of like thematically, what are the core pieces that we believe are enduring?
Yeah. So like thinking from the beginning, how is this going to grow and scale as my company does the same?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's interesting. Like I think of, I'm someone, for example, even when I think of our own team brands, right? I'm someone that really believes in guardrails with flexibility. I'm not someone that really believes in like hard and fast, rules. So if it was going to be a culture where it was going to be like, black and white, there's always a right or wrong. Like ultimately, I know that's not a place where I would even thrive. So if a culture starts shifting in a way and it makes sense for the business, I think it's also a natural way of people self-selecting in or out. But being intentional, I think, upfront as to what are we trying to build, how are we trying to get there, and then just mapping that out.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a question from Keith. He's asking, how have you specifically weaved in values throughout the interview process?
Keith, through the interview process, I think it really depends. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. Depends on the value. I like to weave values literally into everything I do from a people process. So can definitely give some tangible examples when it comes to like compensation, other things, but even from an interview perspective, sometimes even just asking about them, right? I worked at an organization years ago. They had 9 core values, and we would ask questions about these core values. It was a company that was really focused on entrepreneurship and helping small businesses succeed. So we would ask questions around like, hey, what's your connection to small businesses? And again, it didn't even have to be a right answer, or there isn't a right answer or a wrong answer, but we would just ask people kind of open-ended questions on how they thought about it. And we had an internal scale around that. If there's a value that's a little bit more, say there's a value around, teamwork and problem solving, or again, I'm kind of spitballing here. I think there's opportunities where you could have an interview where sometimes people are doing some sort of small project in the interview. So if feedback's a big part of the culture and that teamwork's part of the culture, I would incorporate a section where we do open feedback in that session. You see how someone's responding to that feedback. So I think it's really more around distilling, well, what would I like to see? How can we create a rubric? And then being open to testing things out. Because everyone might not give you the exact answer you're looking for, but it's more of like, how are people thinking about this? And then also when it comes to values, I think it depends on how many values you have as an organization. There are times that some values may be way more prevalent. Like I know that organization that I worked at that had 9 core values, there are probably like 8 that I was like, yes, this is me. And this other one, I'm like, I believe in it. I can see why it's important for others. It's less important for me, but you could talk through like how I could connect the dots there. So we can definitely talk a little bit more offline on specifics if you Keith want to share with me like your company values and you want to get really specific on how to incorporate that. We can absolutely come up with an exercise. I also like to tie it to competencies, and there's lots of great competency-based questions. So if your values can connect to a competency and you can have that alignment internally, that's another way of really building out an interesting scorecard.
Thanks, Gabriela. Thank you, Keith. Would love to kind of go on the subject of employee experience. In our catch-up call, you talked a bit about the importance of an employee value prop. So I'd love if you could share kind of why is this so important in the early days of building a company, and also if you could share an example of an employee value prop that stands out to you as well.
It's funny. So I've been at Chronosphere for just over 3 months now, and I feel like the whole team internally must be so sick of me saying, well, let's get the values right before we put this in place. Because it must feel like I'm like, hurry up and then slow down. Because I think that's so important for me, because I think the employee value prop needs to stem from your employee values or your company values, or else it's almost like cart before the horse, right? Or you're trying to retrofit pieces in. So we are revamping kind of our company like vision, mission, and we're in the process of redoing our values. So for me, once you have that, that's the foundation. Then you can think through, okay, now how do we build our employee value prop? Like, what's the value prop of someone coming to work at our organization versus another organization? And again, it stems on the culture that you're building every single day through that. And then I think you think through it from your programs. So, compensation is something that there's so many people that are building out comp structure, comp strategy, talent strategy, especially right now and how competitive this market is. So when I think of compensation, I think oftentimes people feel that as soon as you have a great compensation database, it's like you punch in a number, you push a button, it gives you all the comp that you need, right? So I think people that don't do comp think it's like very scientific based, but and there's definitely a mix of it there. You definitely have the data, but it's a mix of that art and science, and you want to structure it into your values and that value prop. So if you're an organization where you're saying it's about team, we're really building team, that you probably want some strong team components in how you design your goals and how you incentivize and how you're thinking about your variable compensation. It should stem through that. If you're a culture where you really are focused more on like individual heroics, maybe you really kind of over-index on that side of the incentive plan. If it's a mix, it's a mix. And I think it's also in the way you talk about it, because how you talk about it is reinforcing that employee value prop and reinforcing the values. Because someone could have the exact same comp plan, and someone might just say, oh, this is how they comp us at this startup. But if you go back and say, okay, this is the why behind it. So the reason we have this team component is because it's tied to this value prop that we have over here of like, we're all in it together. But we also know that there's that need for individual heroics. So we reserve this other piece here. This is why refresh and equity is so important to us, because we really believe in that culture of everyone being an owner, not just when you start off, but really like recognizing that value. So every little thing I think you can do from a people perspective, whether it's compensation, performance management, how you do promotions, how you think of leveling, how you exit, how you communicate internally, the internal comms, all of those things should really tie to culturally what you're trying to build and what that employee value prop, what it is. People talk, right? Like people are going to talk about what it's like to work somewhere. So I wouldn't say it's never about selling something that is fake or false. It's really being authentic to who we are, and then making sure that you're able to showcase that in a really, really thoughtful way.
I love it. You touched briefly on benefits, and I'm sure that's a big thing people are thinking about, especially when they're first starting a company. How are you kind of seeing that changing right now in this hybrid world? If there's been evolutions there, and what have you seen as reactions from this in the talent marketplace?
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. So I can say for recently, well, not so recently, but when the pandemic first started, at Drizly, we were mainly kind of an in-house company. We had an office in New York, Denver, and Boston. Boston was our biggest site. And we were probably, I can't remember exactly, but maybe under 5% remote employees outside of those offices. So again, we did a lot of perks in the office. Things that you would have other places, right? We had the food, we had the lunches, we had exercise classes. And what I'm really happy about is at Drizly, when the pandemic hit, we shifted our perk strategy before the second half of that fiscal year. So it was like May, we had the strategy and we locked it in place, kind of before like July 1. And really the thought process there was, while oftentimes at a lot of these kind of rapidly growth, hyper growth tech companies, you were seeing a lot of kind of like the perks, right? Like the games, the exercise, the beer, and all of that. And again, not that it was about those perks, but the perks really rounded things out. And our hypothesis pretty early on, in kind of like that April timeframe, was at this point in the pandemic, and again, we're talking a month and a half into the pandemic, we were saying people had seen massive loss, just loss in general, right? Loss of freedom. Some people had experienced loss of loved ones, loss of jobs, loss of steady income. Like there was just such an experience of loss. And so our hypothesis was that a lot of these smaller perks that really were differentiators in the beginning were no longer going to be as important. As people started experiencing this loss, they were really going to think a little bit more. They were going to come at it from a place of just having a longer sight line for it, right? People are going to be thinking about job security, maybe about paying back student loans, health insurance, and all of these other aspects. So we really want to make sure that we were reinvesting there. We were also switching to more of a remote first culture. We're going to open up hiring across the United States. So we wanted to make sure that our benefits were really just like that we had excellent benefits, that we were taking into consideration all of these more longer term aspects, and that we were still doing the perks that we could do in a way that was a little bit more individualized, because as we were kind of had a broader scope on talent and how we were hiring, we knew that people's needs and motivations were really, really different. I think there's another opportunity as we think about that. And now at Chronosphere is, again, and not to go down the path of any type of, so as soon as I catch myself saying this, I'm like, stop talking, Gabrielle. So not to make this a political conversation, because it's not political, right? But so at Chronosphere, we're a company that's saying we're really committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So as we think about that, there's so many things that we could be doing, especially as people leaders, when it comes to healthcare and insurance, especially if you're global. So talent, like perks, benefits, those are maybe not the key differentiator why someone chooses your company, but it's going to be a factor in someone choosing your company. So you say that being, DEI is really important. Are you really looking at the benefits that you have, right? Are your benefits inclusive, right? Are you being thoughtful around, maybe IVF payments for someone if you're trying to be more gender inclusive? There are certain states in the US where they've taken away counseling for people that are maybe struggling through particular issue. There's a lot of things that are happening all over the place. So I think if it's understanding like what your core value prop is, like if you're committed to diversity, then what does it actually look like? And do our benefits actually showcase that if someone's going to hold your kind of feet to the fire? I think there's a huge opportunity for us to do that now as an entire people, as people leaders, because we can raise the table stakes. Because so often you're talking to these benefits brokers and they come back and they say, look, this is table stakes and this is where you can differentiate. I'm looking at it from the other side of, as a tech community, we can absolutely raise the table stakes across the board, because there are certain benefits that are still considered fringe that I absolutely believe should be table stakes, and would have a massive impact when it comes to thinking about underrepresented groups. Off my soapbox, sorry about that.
No, I love that soapbox. And it all comes back to what I'm learning, and it all comes back to your values, right? You bring those values to everything you're doing, including those benefits, including, your hiring. So
and there's such great things out there, right? There's so many amazing startups that are doing these great perks and stuff. So finding a great benefits broker and saying, these are our values, these are our non-negotiables, this is where we really want to make sure that we are above, like just like setting a new standard. There's that, working with the right benefits broker is going to give you all of those awesome just opportunities to say like, oh, let's test this, and this out. So I think that's how you differentiate also.
Absolutely. Especially in this market right now when, only salary or other things could only be so much of a differentiator. You have to give benefits and other opportunities to make you really stand out as an employer of choice.
And I think with that too, even if it's comp, if you're standing on comp and you're saying, okay, we're going to lead the comp, right now the market is so crazy. I'll lead the market strategy. Even if you go to the 90th percentile, right? Like there's always going to be someone that's going to pay more. There's always going to be someone that's going to pay more. So I think if you are just like leveraging on compensation, awesome, knowing that as soon as someone pays more, if that's the only if that's the big EVP or that's the big driver of that, you're going to lose that person the next time someone else is able to pay more. So really rounding that, or being super comfortable with high attrition after a year. You know what I mean? It's like sometimes you make those trade-offs. So I think it's also understanding the trade-offs that you're making, why you're making them, and do they align to your overarching strategy? Because everyone's strategy is going to be a little bit different.
Absolutely. So that kind of relates to our next topic as well in hiring. So I'd love to hear from you kind of what common mistake, or I'm sure mistakes, you've seen early leaders make when it comes to hiring, and what have you learned to prevent those mistakes?
Yeah, I think kind of as we mentioned earlier, I think people just jumping in and like trying to just craft a draft a job description on what they believe they need. So I'm a big believer in competency-based hiring. So I love taking a step back and saying, aligning on a competency dictionary and just saying, okay, what do we really need this role to be? If it's a role that has a handful of stakeholders, ask everyone what their input should be. And I think if you get it down to what are the actual competencies that make this role successful, the dialogue that you get there can just be mind-blowing when it comes to an alignment perspective. Because how often have you seen at a smaller company, especially for some of these more senior strategic roles, that you have this team of people that are interviewing, even if you've done all the right steps, right? If you've had your kickoff meeting and you're like, you're examining this and you're examining this, and this is what the role is. Sometimes in those debriefs, you'll see that you get like just really different perspectives. And oftentimes I find it's a lack of alignment up front as to what do we absolutely need? What do we believe are the non-essentials for the role? What are the goals for the roles? And just really understanding the essentials and the nice to haves. So I love kind of doing a more robust intake process, getting really, really clear on what we're looking for, because I believe that slowing down up front helps align all the stakeholders. It really gives the hiring manager and the department heads an opportunity to build that clarity on their org design, on the goals, and help being more intentional and thoughtful of scale. But most importantly, it's going to help the talent acquisition team be incredibly strategic and move much faster on that. I think the other mistake that I see happen at a lot of rapidly growing companies is they think that when they bring on someone for talent acquisition or they hire a talent acquisition team, that hiring is now solved. Talent acquisition is the tip of the spear. TA is everybody's role at a rapidly growing company. They are the tip of the spear, and they are kind of like your SWAT team going in, right? Like they are the first people you lead in, but it is a collective effort of the entire organization. So I think that's another common mistake. And I think the other thing too is people, you're moving so quickly in those startups. If you don't give yourself time to really reflect and think, okay, what roles do I need? Because if you're able to do that and you think about the role, then oftentimes it has you think about other additional roles that you might need or how that might map out. So it gives you that space to be really thoughtful, because oftentimes I also see people needed that hire yesterday. So even if they were really, really diligent and put their job description together and did all the right steps, they might cut corners and say, it's better to have someone than no one, even if I know they're not the right person. And again, I'm not going to sit here and say you should never make that trade-off, because there's definitely been times where you might be faced with a trade-off like that, but really understanding I am making a trade-off. This is why I'm making the trade-off, and being able to articulate that, or ideally put yourself in a position where you have enough space that you don't have to go down that path of those trade-offs.
I think that's really smart, especially agreed with Keith Klein. He said it's a collective effort. Amen. Yes, it's not, you have your TA people and you're like, okay, have fun. See you later. Especially in an early stage startup, it's everyone's goals and efforts to make sure that you're getting those A+ people.
And in this market, it's insane. You know what I mean? And it's also clarity on who those A+ are. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. So often I hear people talk about A people, B people, C people. I believe that any human can be an A+ person if they're aligned and they're in an organization where again, there's alignment from a values perspective and directional alignment on what we're trying to achieve. So I think oftentimes people are like, oh, I want an A player, and assume if they were an A player there, they're going to be an A player here, and they just focus on those previous results. But it's also, are you fostering an environment in which they can be successful and thrive? And that's where that values alignment, that EVP is so vital.
I think that's a really important point too, that you're not always an A+ player. You could be a B player somewhere, but if you're in the right organization with the right leaders and the right managers, you could then be transformed, to become that A+ people. Or maybe you always had it in you, you just weren't at the right places. Another question from the group is, can you elaborate a little bit more on how you've hired for Competency versus how you've seen others approach this?
Absolutely. So how I've seen others approach it, I can't speak as much to that. I think different people I've seen, I think there's different ways of doing it. I think it's easier for me to speak just about how I've done it. So I think just aligning on a competency dictionary, and this is not an intentional plug for them. I'm a big fan of Korn Ferry. Back in the day in Apple, they used to use one called Lomingers. I've heard it called different things, as like a really robust competency dictionary. I think it was like 67 competencies. Well, Korn Ferry purchased that, and they purchased like the 3 kind of biggest competency dictionaries, formed it all into the Korn Ferry leadership architecture, was like 38 competencies. I like this. It's a card deck. It's simple. It's tangible. And I have an L&D background. So I really use this because for me, again, the entire employee life cycle, this is where I gotta geek out so much on my job. It's all about like, how do we maximize the lifetime value of this asset, right? Looking at these assets as humans. So these humans that join our organizations, they're the greatest asset we have. We're trying to maximize it because it's ultimately, if you're in a for-profit company, like where we have the goal, and that goal is to increase revenue, to make profit, and we're doing it with these amazing humans. So I believe you can be people-centric, but you're still a business first. So when I think about it from that perspective, why I love competencies is from an L&D background. It makes it a lot easier to think about growth and development when you know what skills that you're trying to build upon and how you're trying to develop people. I also think that when, development is really important to people, and at a lot of these startups or rapidly growing companies, people say, I want to develop. And that just turns into, I want to get promoted. And so then it becomes like this cycle on like, how quickly can we promote and what does that mean? And I really like to focus more on like growth and development. Not saying that promotions aren't part of it. Of course they are. But when people really feel like their skills are growing and they can like articulate where they've gotten better and like sit there and say, wow, I was less confident and less competent here, but now I did this project and I've gained skills here, and here, and I've done this, and this. It rounds out their story. It makes it easier for them and their own personal brand when it comes to whatever that next role could be. I think then you have an organization full of people that really feel that they're being developed and that they are also pioneering their own path and they have ownership of that development. So that's where I like competency. So sorry, I know I just went down a little like tirade down that path. But so for me, the reason it's important to have that competency dictionary up front when you think of the role, it's, well, what are the competencies that we really believe are essential for this role to be successful? So I just do a traditional card sort, right? You look at it and you say, okay, what are the most essential? Narrow that down. Then you say, okay, out of these, what are the most essential? That's a great conversation for stakeholders, make sure there's alignment, and then it can really help you kind of craft what that role looks like and what it is. And then I think I really start to, at every stage of the interview process, I think it's, you're using it as a very traditional funnel. So there should be some sort of barrier to entry or some sort of assessment that you're making based on each of the competencies or each of kind of the experience must-haves, skill, competency, and experience. You're narrowing it closer and closer and closer, because that way, when you end up with that hire, let's say they aced everything on the scorecard, 6 months from now, if we're still hiring positions in that role and it's not working, then we can go back and say, okay, these are the competencies. We did match the competencies well, but maybe these competencies aren't really matched to the role or the deliverables that we need. How can we pivot? How can we switch this? From an L&D perspective, I think it's also really helpful then, because then your L&D team knows these are the competencies that we see across 75% of the organization. So we might want to build courses on those internally. Hey, these competencies are really important to this role over here. That might be something that we want to do a build versus buy from a development perspective. So I think it also helps you with that entire EVP. So I don't know if that fully answered the question on how I would hire to it, but it's more of like how you hire to it and then string it along all the way through the end.
That's such a good question, a great answer. I have a few more questions on hiring, and I would love to dive a little bit deeper into team leadership and then get some more audience questions. So, as we've said, there's so much competition right now in the market. What are some tactics that we haven't just talked on already that you've seen work to close top candidates?
So I don't know if it's things that you haven't seen already. I think there's people that try to be outside of the box and they try to be really creative. I worked with an amazing woman at Infusionsoft who was just so intentional about like, how do we just really create a candidate experience that's like just above board in everything that they do. And so I think that was a great example. And so I feel like anything that I can think of was already done, at least by her. But I think that candidate experience also mirrors what people believe your employee experience will be, right? So I think just what I've seen a couple of mistakes, and this happened to me once, where you get hired and it might be months early and then there's a lack of engagement. It's almost like, holy crap, do I have a job? Am I not starting? What's happening? So remembering that as a company, you might be moving really fast to close someone, but once you close them, it's like, oh, great, we're done, move on. It's not done for that person. So thinking of those little touch points and how you continue to keep them engaged so they don't experience any buyer's remorse. But oftentimes it's little things, right? What I think is most impactful is I've seen some organizations that are like, for this level and up, we get them all a bottle of wine. For this level and this, we do this. I think it's more about being authentic and being really intentional. So, and again, that's nothing crazy, but deciding if that is something that you really want to do as an organization, and someone is extra, special, or do you do it for everyone, or do you only do it for a certain amount of people? I can say for me, one of the reasons, and it's not the only reason I joined Chronosphere, they're an amazing team. I was just so inspired with the leadership here and just how incredibly high EQ and IQ they all have. But a small little thing that made a difference to me is at the beginning of one of our interviews, I swear it was maybe a 15-second thing that I mentioned where someone said, well, how was my weekend? And there was a qualifying match for the World Cup between, Brazil and Argentina. And they ended up not playing the game. And it was like a huge thing because of COVID. And anyone who watches soccer out there, you'll know what I'm talking about, which is a little bit of crazy. I support Argentina. So I was just like, oh, it was a little bit crazy. We're watching the game. Oh, you watch soccer? Yeah. My family's Argentinian. Great. Literally, that was it. It was like maybe 10 seconds. But then I got a jersey in the mail and it just talked about how, and again, it's not about the jersey. I have an obnoxious amount of Argentina jerseys, but the idea, right? Someone doing a little bit, taking that little moment to say, hey, with you on this team, we really believe that we can be a championship team as well, right? And Argentina had just won the Copa America, but it was something small where it was meaningful to me. It wasn't, I would have appreciated a bottle of wine. I don't even need anything like that, like a small gift, but a heartfelt note, just knowing that someone's thinking about it. But for me, the biggest thing that goes a long way is transparency, right? When someone's saying, hey, Gabriela, this is how we hire. This is why I want you. And I think the more you can be transparent with people, the more you can really highlight your employee value prop, what your values are and how your candidate experience is anchored in that. I think that goes a really long way to close people. And again, it's not about closing everyone. I think it's more about closing the people that are going to 10x your organization, and you have a greater likelihood of that happening when they're aligned to your values and that employee value prop.
Yes. Jesse put it perfectly in the chat, surprise and delight in that candidate experience. I think that's so true.
She's fabulous. I would listen to everything she says. So if anyone actually wants really great tips and tricks, I would talk to Jessie, who's on this call. She's amazing.
Jesse, we'll have you on next time. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think it's the thought that they were truly listening to you and made you feel, special and heard is better than, any bottle of wine. It's kind of that, we like to call it at _ like that 11-star experience. And so team leadership development. So what was one of the unexpected things that you've learned about developing leadership in others? And, why was it unexpected to you?
I think the most, and not that this is unexpected, the thing that constantly surprises me is I can't tell you how many times I had one of these moments earlier this week where if anyone from my team is here, they'll know what I'm talking about, where I'm like, Gabriela, I used to teach this. How am I not following? Like, this is something we used to have courses on that people would, invest dollars in learning about these things with leadership. I think with so many things with leadership and management development, it's going back to basics and that it's a continuum, right? Like, it's not like you've learned it and you're done, you're a great leader. There's so many times you have to go back to basics. And, right now it's just being fully transparent. Like, I'm so used to people that have worked with me and people that know me, they know who I am at my core. They know my values and they know that. So oftentimes I don't have to declare my intent because it's just when people know me, they know how I show up in the world. And you start kind of making assumptions that people just know where you're coming from. So now I have this really new team. They're growing really, really quickly. And I haven't really been as intentional on spending enough time so they know who I am as a human, right? Outside of my directs, when I'm talking like skip levels and others. So it's again, so that like moment of like face, like smacking your head of like, oh, this is so easy, right? Like we haven't established trust because I haven't really shared, like, it's all about intent, integrity, results, and capabilities. Like, I've showcased these, but not these. How can I spend more time and be more intentional there? So that's, I would say, is the most surprising, is that it doesn't matter how senior you get or how many times you've done it. It's like, there's always going to be those moments of like, yep, cool. I know better. Let's go back and look at the tools. Let's go back to sharpening the saw. So I think there's those. I think really when it comes to leadership, like, there's so many different frameworks and everyone's trying to reinvent the wheel. But like, I think so much of what's out there is just being regurgitated of like just simple things. Like, I go back to like 7 Habits. It was written probably 40, 50 years ago. Like, it's a great book and it's really about being human. And we've seen leadership evolve so many times, but this idea of servant leadership, of authentic leadership, really feels like it's started emerging over the last decade, and it feels like it's here to stay. And so for me, it really aligns with how I like to lead, but it's more around like just understanding yourself and knowing that you can flex your approach, and being intentional about that, right? Being intentional about flexing that approach. And also that leadership doesn't come with a position. Leadership is influence, right? To be a leader, that means that people are wanting to follow, and that can come from anywhere. And I think as organizations, we have a responsibility to really be intentional on how do we build that, and how do we move that forward in a way where people feel that they can grow. Because while I don't believe it is the job of a company to be the sole responsible party in developing others, I do think in this competitive landscape, it has become a responsibility of the company to create an environment in which people feel that they can, where they can develop and they feel supported in that development and potentially even guided in that. I think it's definitely become a responsibility of the organization.
Absolutely. So I have one final question I want to ask, and then I'll open up to the audience. Selfishly, I would love to just keep asking you questions, but I'm being very nice today. This is on fail forward, as we like to call it. Can you share a story about failure in your, own career or one of the startups that you worked with?
Oh my goodness, I feel like I fail all the time. So I think it's, I think failure is actually really, really healthy because then you pivot, you learn from it, and you can move faster. So I would say I fail quite often, but I try to give myself like limited scopes. If it's going to fail, it's like a quick pivot, or you can learn from it, or you're saying, hey, we're testing this out and this out. So I'm trying to think of like something really big, something small, like, from a small thing, from a talent side, when this was a little bit of a fail, when last year, when Colorado rolled out the pay equity law, where you had to post salary ranges in there. The reason it was difficult for Drizly to do so is at the time we were doing geo-based salaries. So especially with that, even if you put in that it was Colorado specific, that there's so many different sites that are scraping the internet to put ranges in there. We didn't want to dissuade anyone from a job putting a Colorado-based salary if they were in California or another area, right? And someone might have questions on, is this equitable versus being equal and all of that. So I can give you kind of all the reasoning that went behind that comp structure where we were. But bottom line, that was our comp structure. We couldn't find ourselves aligning to this law. So we came up with a thing where we were like, we want to be compliant, but we also want to make sure we're intentional. So we did some A/B testing on if we did broad bands, if we did small bands. So we ended up going forward and just duplicating all of our job postings. We did narrow bands truly for the job, for Colorado specific. We did all our other roles remote, excluding Colorado. And it was a failure because then the AG came out and said that was actually not going to be compliant, that it didn't count. And again, it took a couple, rolled all this out, and then we pivoted. And then you end up having to almost defend, like, are you a company that's against pay equity? And of course we weren't, and that wasn't the case. So I would say now it's definitely a little bit easier to tackle that, where the organization where I am now, we're doing a one geo approach when it comes to compensation. So again, I think that's a mistake, but sometimes it's like looking at those mistakes or that failures, but also testing and saying, okay, if we test, let's iterate on this. But there's so many different things. I think performance management, like sometimes there's new tools that I'd like to test out that don't work out, but I think it's really important to know, like, what's the scope of this? What could the impact be of this failure? And even defining what a failure looks like. I think oftentimes we test new things and we say, this is what success looks like. But sometimes we have marginal success and it's not really successful. So you don't know when to stop. So I think also mapping out, like, if you don't achieve X, Y, Z in X amount of time, it is a failure. And that's when we're going to pivot and come up with something else. So I think defining it's really important as well.
I think you're also never going to be innovative if you are going to be not trying new things that potentially are going to be failed. If you know it's going to succeed, you're not being as risky as you could be being.
Well, it's funny, kind of a fail fast. Another one that just came to me, when you said a fail fast, example. At Drizly, when I was there, we were trying to do a little bit more innovation. So I started the Fails Fast Award. So we had 2 company values awards and we started a Fail Fast Award. And I think the failure there was people were really uncomfortable with the name and no one really wanted to be nominated for Fail Fast. Fear on like nominating people. So I really believe that if with a little bit more, we could have kind of transitioned that, but that was almost a comical one of like failure on failing fast is that people don't really like winning an award for failing. So how do we like shift the mentality?
I guess it's not a compliment for your manager or at least maybe you don't feel like it's a compliment for your manager to nominate you for that. And I like the intention behind it. So let me just share some of these questions from our audience. Zoe is asking about your experience going through a big acquisition from Drizly to Uber on the people ops side. Any advice you have for other people ops execs who haven't been through that before but may in the future? What helped you get through that very intense process, and what should people keep in mind?
I think that, completely transparently, what got me through that intense process, or the parts of it that I was involved in, was high degree of trust with our leadership team, because when you're going through a roller coaster ride, and especially in those foxhole moments where there's few people that know about what's happening, because there's usually so much confidentiality, just being able to pick up the phone and call people and just having that that internal network. And then usually when you're going through that, you might have your number one, having a number one or your number two that you can really trust. I don't know if Zoe, if you really want to hear this, I think wine also helped me get through it. But like, I don't know if I should admit that. So honestly, transparently, I actually left before the acquisition completely went through. So I left before we closed on that. And also, I think the process was going to be very different because the what was kind of committed to on the Uber side, what was decided was we were going to remain independent, you know, and that would really be driven. So there wasn't really a timeline with it. So even as we were going through that, I think initially it was mapping out where did we want to be connected? How are we going to remain independent, but still feel like we were part of that parent company? So there was a lot of work and a lot of thought going into that process. And now we're kind of on the other side of that. Again, but I left before that acquisition happened. But what I would say is if people are thinking of going through it, like talk to people that have gone through it, right? What worked, what didn't work. I was talking to a lot of companies, you know, and even like if they say independent, what does that typically look like? How long are people typically independent? What are the key drivers of that? What are the risks? And just having really authentic dialogue around some of the concerns. I don't know if anything can ever really prepare you for any of these roller coaster rides, but I think talking to as many people as you can, knowing that everything's going to be completely different. And then just being able to admit for yourself, are you up for the ride? You know what I mean? Because like roller coasters can be really fun. So just knowing like there's going to be some ups and downs and I just have to stick through it.
Yeah, I love that idea of just talking to others that have been through it, especially, you know, if it's your first time doing so. A question from Val. How about making sure that toxic individuals are not hired or retained, even if they're top performers? Is that something you were able to successfully implement or get buy-in from executives to show long-term win for the company?
Yeah. So this is another reason where I think that values alignment is so important. Now, I think there's the other negative side to values where you can weaponize almost anything, right? So I like when we do values to really thinking about what is this value, really describing it, what isn't it, which is usually often like the exact opposite. And then I also like what's the counterfeit version of this. And I like what that counterfeit version, because that also oftentimes like speaks to how it can be weaponized. I think the earlier you have that up front, I think it's easier to hire, to not make short-term decisions, even if we think it's better for the company, because this is the thing too. If it's the word toxic, toxic can look, it's almost like a player, I think, right? Where someone, any person can be an A player at any company, and any person can probably be toxic at any company. It's really more of how you show up and what the values are and what the norms of the organization are. So I think that if it's something that's truly feels like a values counterfeit or like someone who is an antithesis to the values, I've been successful in getting buy-in from other leaders and just saying like, most people have experiences where they've seen that before, right? And just talking through like, if we're hiring for this is what could happen, right? These are the ramifications long-term of doing that. And so it's usually not ever worth those short-term wins. If you're in a situation where you think it is a short-term win or we need this top performer, what I've typically done there is contract roles. A contract, especially if it's a project based, where you're like, okay, we still need this work done, but we don't think this person's going to be a long-time cultural add to this company. Or we think this person could show up, to use your words, Val, of toxic. Then we could say, hey, could we do this as a project based? Really starts testing out like, you know, that's one option of looking at it. So I think there's that. Again, I think oftentimes like when you have that alignment, when people have experienced it, they're not going to want to hire someone that could potentially be toxic because you feel the ramifications of that long term. And most people have that conversation. They've had that experience, right? If you ask someone like, hey, have you ever seen this play out? When has it ever worked? Right. And I feel like you can almost ask anyone, everyone's going to have a story of like, oh yeah, that time. Because even if that person's successful, what about all the other humans that are there that are like, I don't want to work with this person. And again, toxic, it's such a blanket statement. It could mean so many different things. But I think it's just getting really, really clear up front and just saying, hey, we're not going to make these short-term decisions. Or if we have to make the short-term decisions, have a real authentic conversation on the pros, the cons, and think about other ways that you could do it. Again, project-based contract, if it's like something that could be segmented as a project, I think is an easy compromise in that situation.
Absolutely. And then it's also like the message that it sends to others, like it's okay for this person to act maybe in a specific way because they're going to get promoted.
Yeah.
Anyway, a question from Brent. What are the top 3 pitfalls regarding people would you advise early stage CEOs to watch out for?
I'm sure I'm going to kick myself at the end of this and be like, oh, I should have said this. This would have been so much better. I think it's oftentimes people think I don't have to define my culture too early. I think it's never too early to start thinking about the culture that you want to build, especially because that's going to make it so much easier for your team to really think about attracting talent, retaining talent, aligning that talent, right? And so much, everything we do is through humans, right? Like it's either through the automation that's being built by humans or it's through the humans, right? So really aligning that I think is super, super important. So I think oftentimes people think we don't have to really build it or be intentional about the culture up front. I think the other thing is honestly, so many times, even at startups, I'm seeing companies saying, yes, we don't need HR. We need to move more towards people. But they look at these kind of historical ratios on HR where they're like, well, you don't really need your first HR person until you hit 100 people. And then the ratio should be 1 for every 100. Like times are changing, right? And the transition from more of an HR lens to more of a proactive people operations lens, and how and I should say not necessarily proactive, but the way looking at humans as those assets, it's a different perspective. It's a completely different mindset, which means that the historical ratios aren't going to match. So if you're really intentional about humans and you want to be competitive, I think building that team early makes sense. So I think that's another thing too, where I see people waiting a long time before they bring on G&A, and they don't scale G&A as quickly as they scale the other sides. Not that it has to scale as fast, but your ratios should stay, should be intentional about those ratios. And I would say the third pitfall is, so again, early stage founders are going to hate this, and I'm so sorry I'm saying this. I'm not trying to antagonize anyone. For the candidate and the talent you're trying to bring on, your company is not that different, right? Like I hear from some people like, but we're different because, and we're different, right? It's your baby, founder. Of course it's different for you. This is your baby. This is your child. This is your company. And what I've told people in this, it's whether it's projects or your startup or something huge like a company, it's going to sound terrible, but like sometimes our babies are ugly. And if you're the parent, it's really hard to admit that your baby's ugly. So, just really noticing like, this might be my baby and I can love my baby, but it could be an ugly baby to someone else. So I need to acknowledge that. And I talk to so many founders that are like, you should come work here and we're different because X, Y, Z, but there's so many other companies that are pitching the exact same thing. So be ready to defend it. Make sure that you have alignment on exactly what it is you're looking for, because you need to be able to articulate that. Because if you can't articulate your culture, if you don't know how your comp strategy aligns to that, if you don't know how your performance management aligns to that, then you're not able to show how you differentiated internally from that employee experience. And then, so I see founders sometimes losing people on that because they're like, we're different. So you should want to work here because we're different, and you should take a pay cut, and you should take this, and you should take this because we're so different. Sometimes you find someone that's really excited to go on that ride. But if you're looking someone to look for a little bit seasoned with that experience, just understanding, okay, I need to get my value prop really, really clear. I need to be intentional about how quickly I want to bring on my people and talent side. And I need to recognize that while I love this baby, it could be an ugly baby. So how do I think about what's different about it? Brent, you probably hated those. I don't know if those are the right ones. I'm going to kick myself later on. I'm sure next time I'm going to be emailing you like, I should have said this.
He said it was practical advice. So it
Excellent.
sounds like you answered it well. Lily did have a follow-up question to that. So when do you recommend someone, an early stage company hires their first head of people?
I think it depends on how quickly you're growing, right? So if you are growing pretty quickly, but you're thinking over the next 2 years, you're going to sit at, you're not going to cross over 100%. You're going to be one geo, one location. I think you should still hire someone, but you could probably go with someone a little bit more mid-level that has the opportunity to really have, that has like really high upside. So I would base it on those things. There's not a one size fits all. If you're a company that's saying you're going to you want to have like 300% growth in your first year, you want to get over 100, you're going to have like global, you want to be remote first. Those things are a little bit more challenging. You need someone a little bit more experience. You might want to hire up a little bit more. So there's a few of these different things.
Cool. Let me share one other question. What are your culture automation and scale secrets for early stage startups?
Yeah. So we're still, going to be building a lot of this. So oftentimes, so many of your HRISs, you can have just easy messaging, right? So I would say anything that you can, the way I tell myself is if I have to send this email twice, or if I have to do this twice, I need to think of a way to automate it. And so, anniversaries, half anniversary, I think can also go a long way. Leveraging your HRIS for any of those things that you want to send out. At the last several companies that I've been at, we've incorporated, again, like transparently, we've incorporated HubSpot internally just for our people team, and just because there's so many messages that we can do internally. So I love doing, again, the little messages. You can do little automatic, like there's so many different things, like if this then that, or Zapier, we can have zaps that create like, so I would think about like, what's your employee value prop? What are the moments and what are those milestone moments that we really want to double down on that align with kind of what we recognize in our culture? So when I think of the employee experience, I think of when you first go through a review cycle, right? That can be really tough for some people because they don't know how you review people here. I could have come from a culture where they were really strict. I could have come from a culture where everything was glowing. So if I get a meets now, I'm going to be devastated because I've always been exceeding. Like, so anytime you can think of those moments where people might have like, they might get really nervous or really struggle. Times of promotions, if you have promotion cycles, when someone's hiring someone for the first time, if someone just got promoted to manager, like there's certain times where you can say, hey, we're probably gonna have to double down here. So I like to think of what are the practices that we can put in place, and then are there any other things that I can automate around that? Just like whether it's articles or thought starters, things like that. So I would think of like map out any key inflection moments in the employee life cycle, whether it's an anniversary or a birthday or a promotion time, and then think through how can we offer support here? How can we let someone know we care here in an authentic way, and then figure that out. This other thing I like, which again, I'm not trying to plug it, but someone sent me a gift on goodie.com, and it's like one of my favorite apps right now. So it's something that I've used with candidates. It's something that I've used when people are like, oh, I'm having a like you find out about a baby or life moment. It's like very easy. I get to send a gift via text and people think I'm on top of it, and they don't realize that it is just an app that has made my life so much easier.
I definitely need to check that out for myself personally too. And then what I think final question probably before we wrap. Do you value referral candidates differently than any other candidate?
I would say yes and no. So referrals, typically you see a higher close. Again, just really typically, at least what I've seen in an organization where I've been, typically you see higher pass-through rates. Typically you might see ramp up could be a little bit shorter. I think there's a lot of negative aspects that also come from a really strong referral culture. If it's not done well, it can be a lot more of unintentional. There can just be a lot more bias with it, right? It can really kind of throw a thorn in the side of any diversity goals or really trying to bring on more underrepresented groups. Again, it really depends. But I think that harnessed the right way, it's a really rich opportunity. So what we built at my previous company, we built a referral program where we really wanted to make sure that we were focused on underrepresented groups. So and we wanted to also be part of the solution in a systemic way. So we actually said, hey, referrals, we'll take referrals. This is the broad swath of referrals that we're looking for. We did incentivize groups for our people for the referrals bringing in if they were hired and stayed on at least 6 months. And then for any referral that was part of, that identified as part of an underrepresented group that was hired, we wouldn't do an additional donation to a program that was really trying to solve this at root cause. So people got really excited by that, and it started creating more interest in people wanting to say, I don't just want the cash for me from a referral side, which we did not differentiate there, whether it was someone from an underrepresented group or not. Just because I know some companies are playing with that, not saying that it's right or wrong. We just weren't as comfortable playing in that space yet. But we did get a lot of people that were excited to almost get competitive of, can I raise more for this charity? So that people started really looking outside of their immediate networks and trying to look for underrepresented groups. So I think there's ways that you can have a strong referral culture as long as you're talking through like, this is where it could be the antithesis of some of the things we're trying to do from a diversity side. So we put these practices into place. And the more you talk about it from that perspective, I think it can be super, super helpful. And then also a referral, there's different degrees, right? It could be like hey, this was my college roommate who I know in and out. I know they're going to be successful here and they're going to be amazing. Then there's also referrals of people saying, hey, this is someone in my social media. They know me. They threw my name on there. So I think also just really defining like, what does referral mean to you? And are you comfortable with kind of both ends of the spectrum? And I think I think TA is an everybody job. So the easier we make it for people, I think the more the merrier.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gabriela. This was so insightful. I know I learned a ton. Let's give it up for Gabriela. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
See you again soon too, Gabriela.
Absolutely. I appreciate the questions. And if I can ever be helpful to anyone Again, I know some people have like my contact info, just reach out. And I love learning things from all of you. So I will definitely be excited for the next one of these to learn from your next guest.
Awesome. And I'm sure you'll be receiving an influx of emails now. Thanks, Gabriela. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the Friday and great weekend.
Bye, all.
Bye.